You guys hear me okay?
I hear you just fine, Tor.
Thanks for the sound check.
Hey, can I just test my audio, Tor? Can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me?
I hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thanks.
Mhm.
Tor, since you're in the Unified Command, I didn't look at today's case count yet. Do you know?
Yeah, there's just one.
So glad. Okay, thanks.
Mhm. And
Melissa Haley, can you hear us now?
I can, much better.
Okay, well, now that we got our technical difficulties figured out, I think as soon as we figure out all this, then we won't have to use Zoom anymore, hopefully. But it is 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and call the meeting of Thursday, December 17th, 2020 to order. Please join me for a flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Melissa, roll call, please.
Mayor Eisenbeis,
Present.
Mr. Christensen,
Here.
and Mr. Knox is joining us later. Mr. Mosier,
Here.
Miss Duncan, Miss Hemshoot.
Here.
We're missing Miss Duncan and Miss Nelson.
Thank you. Any correspondence or agenda changes?
I'm on. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can now, Valerie. Yes, thank you. Are there any correspondence or agenda changes for this evening? Okay, we'll move on to persons to be heard for any item off of tonight's agenda. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to be heard on items not on tonight's agenda? Please.
Richard Ween. I feel so lonely. I'm the only member of the public here. Just a couple of random facts. Ludwig van had a birthday this week. Happy birthday. And it wasn't on the 5th. The interesting random fact is that we live in an odd world and that the AMA reversed opposition to hydrochloroquine prescriptions. Go figure. That was on 10/23/20. Another fact is that we recently heard the sounding of the bells, because for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for us. and that there were 300,000 apparent deaths related to COVID, which we passed that gruesome mark. But just for some historical, in 1957, 225,000 people perished with age-adjusted population due to the flu. And in 1968, 165,000 people passed due to with population adjusted figures. So it's again an interesting world we live in. One of the things that is very distressing, and I know that we all know about the issues related to COVID with increases of domestic violence, increases of suicides, mental illness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This interesting tidbit out of Ohio today was that suicide is the leading cause of death in children ages 10 to 14. And it's believed to due to the lockdowns and social isolation, et cetera, which to me is not fathomable or understandable. Of another interesting fact from today is that the Fed maintains interest rates at near zero, which will affect people on fixed incomes and investments, your 401ks, but it's also good for the potential to take out loans. Another interesting thing is that with the new administration, they were listing how the taxes are going to be going up fairly dramatically for a number of people in this country. But most important is the corporate tax. And we know what happens to corporate taxes. It goes downhill. So everyone is going to be paying that as a part of a cost of living. And the final thing is that Sitka has been very blessed, and I will bring this up again and again, and that is most people did not skip a beat with their paychecks. And that I think that that is absolutely wonderful. And the important thing to note is that when you have search, you have federal government jobs, you have city jobs, you have the teachers, you have essential jobs such as Delta Western and Petro Marine and other types of businesses, Seamart and Lakeside, which all people, thank God, have been able to maintain their wages. But when you put that into the filter of that poverty in November in the United States increased 11.7%, and that in the last 6 months, 8 million people crossed into the poverty line. And I think that as time goes on, with restaurant closures, permanent business closures, et cetera, we are going to see this even greater. So I think that we've been blessed in Sitka, and that is something that is very important. And I appreciate you listening, and thank you very much. And I will hopefully be the master of random facts in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public who'd like to be heard tonight? Seeing none, we will move on to a new business. So the agenda tonight consists of discussion, direction, decision on the parameters for the fiscal year 22 municipal budget. Tonight is going to mainly be run by John, and let's see. So we do have a couple decision points at the very end that we would like some guidance on if the assembly can come to. If not, we will roll that into the next one. Melissa Haley will be online on Zoom presenting tonight with the sharing of the screen. Members of the assembly who are on Zoom at home, we can't see each of you individually. So if you do have questions at any time, I ask that you just jump in there and ask those questions for Melissa, unless she wants to hold questions till the end, but I'll leave that discretion up to her and John. So with that, thank you, John, and the meeting is yours.
All right, thanks, Mayor. As you already outlined, we're beginning the, I know it's Christmas Carol, but it's the most wonderful time of the year. We're starting the FY22 budget, and this is our first meeting. And we're going to be looking for big picture guidance on where the assembly would like to go in FY22. I'll apologize in advance for kind of the clunky process here, because we've got our finance director that's presenting on Zoom with the presentation somewhere else, and we'll both be speaking throughout this, and then we'll have a hard time seeing hands for questions. So please bear with us as we try to get through this presentation, and there might be some times where we're talking over each other, but we'll get moving along with it. And with that, Melissa, I'll turn it over and let you get started.
All right, and please do just jump in with any questions or comments as we're going. I think especially with this format, that's going to be the most effective way. So really what we want to talk about tonight, and the presentation is just kind of something, a guide to walk us through this discussion. But we really want to kind of analyze a little bit what happened in especially 2020. So we're talking about fiscal 20 and fiscal 21, and really the impact that we're seeing, and what that means for our FY22 budget. And overall, we want to bring you a budget that starts out as close as we can get. So we have, let's see. We have outlined a process to try to get us there. So this isn't the entire process. This is the process that we have outlined to get us to actually giving you a budget. So, starting today, we really want to get big picture guidance, which we'll get into more detail on. The next meeting, so right now our budget is not fully developed yet. We certainly have pieces of it, things that we know are going to have to be in there, but we're hoping that we'll be able to refine that after this discussion. So by January 21st, we should have a pretty good idea of what's going in there. We'll have really dug into some of our revenue projections, which, to be honest, for this fiscal 22 is quite a challenge. We really don't know, especially with sales tax being our biggest source of revenue, there are just so many unknowns out there. February 4th, we have a joint meeting with the school board, which that's always a very important meeting for us, given that school funding is our biggest single expense. Last year, things went really smoothly. We're able to nail down the school funding early, which made the whole budget process go really well. So that's something to certainly keep in mind. It's not always going to work like that, but when it does, it sure is nice, and it saves everyone a lot of time. February 18th, we have the enterprise fund. So we'll dig in a little more on the enterprise funds. We'll have kind of looked at our models and looked at, different rate scenarios, what's going on with capital, what's going on with operating, and we'll get into a little more detail there. And that brings us to actually getting the draft budget in hand. So looking at the general fund revenue, obviously we had the lovely impact of the pandemic. So that has really impacted our FY20. We actually started out FY20 really strongly. Our first 2 quarters were higher than budgeted. So we were kind of looking really, really good, which was lucky given what happened the second 2 quarters, particularly the second quarter of 2020. And we ended up coming in about 1.4 million lower than what we had brought in sales tax in FY19, and well under what was budgeted, because we had budgeted an increase for FY20. So that obviously has a very big impact.
Melissa, the chart that's in front of us, is that fiscal year to date, or what's the time frame we're looking at?
This is, you're looking at fiscal 19 is blue and fiscal 20 is the brown color.
And that is to date, correct? Or I'm sorry, I understand.
Yeah, no, so it's for the closed fiscal 20. So we're looking at the full years here, and I do have some comparison numbers. When we look at, again, looking at revenue, sales tax is by far our biggest source of revenue, and it has the biggest impact. Property tax it's always pretty steady. You can see there was a slight increase from 19 to 20. But sales tax for looking at the third, okay, so the third calendar quarter in 2020, if you compare that to the third calendar year in 2019, we lost 1.7 million. And that's just comparing the actuals from 2019 to this year. So that obviously has a very big impact, and that's coming on top of the loss that we had for the second quarter as well. Again, the property tax, it's our second biggest source of revenue, but it really, there's not much room. There's nothing we can really do other than making sure we're keeping up with valuations, looking at mandatory exemptions, things like that. There's not much we can do there to change property tax. So it's pretty inelastic.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question?
Yes, please do. Just straight to Melissa or John.
Yeah, so Melissa, do you want us to wait till the end or ask you slide by
No,
slide?
please ask as we go.
Okay, yeah. I don't understand the final line in the last bullet point, additional mandatory and optional exemptions. What are mandatory exemptions and optional exemptions?
So mandatory exemptions are things like the senior exemption, which is mandated by the state. The additional ones are ones that the municipality has put into place over the years. So a lot of these are, nonprofits. That there is a whole list, and it was at some point fairly recently discussed, and I believe there is intentions to bring it back forward to the assembly in the somewhat near future.
And so does optional mean optional? Or
Yes.
Are you saying that mandatory is the state one and optional are what we've put on?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So looking at expenses, so while our revenues fell fairly significantly last year, our expenses were also down. So this is compared year to year. We were under budget, but also compared to our spending in FY19, we were down about $900,000. Most of those areas were in admin and public safety. A lot of the reasons that our expenses fell so much was because we had a number of vacancies. So, as we know, sometimes vacancies can result in higher costs elsewhere. And going into during this year or this fiscal year and last fiscal year, we started to fill some of these vacancies. I think an obvious one is we now have an administrator. So we can't expect to necessarily replicate that. This isn't necessarily a savings. And so as we go into fiscal 22, these vacancies have been filled. So they're not automatic savings there. But you can see our biggest support, and I think this was an old, taken from an old slide. So there is no hospital support in there. That's all school support. So that's very flat. Our public safety actually fell a bit to 2020 from 2019, as did our administrative costs. Public works was fairly flat. And then public services, which that's library, Harrigan. I think I'm missing one there, but those are the big ones. And then our capital outlay was fairly flat. Of course, going into FY21, we cut at least the transfers for capital, though we are still spending there. So the other big, so we had the pandemic's impact on our revenue. There was some pandemic impact on our expenses. There was direction early on to really tighten our belts. Some areas of government shut down for a while. So we had those dual impacts. The other big impact to FY20 was the sale of the hospital. And while it doesn't directly affect the general fund essentially loaned what is now the hospital fund funding. And until all of those outstanding liabilities those funds were used to pay are satisfied, search requires us to keep all of their payments for the hospital in escrow. And so we can't yet pay back that essentially loan between funds. So you'll see the biggest area of change here is that our unassigned fund balance the first column is 2019, went from 5.7 million to 3.8 million. So that is a significant impact. We've been, for the past number of years, our unassigned fund balance has been hovering around 5 million. And when we say unassigned fund balance, that's really what we're looking at as our kind of free and clear, what a lot of people would call our reserves. In addition, we have other funding. We have our liquidity reserve, our emergency reserve, and then, a little bit of non-spendable in 2019. The blue area became much more significant in 2020 because of that loan to the other fund. Because it's being loaned, we can't spend it. The other thing to note is that even though we were hit so hard last year, the total fund balance grew. And that was because we had, we cut our expenses were so much lower.
So I have another question, Melissa. This is kind of hard because I can't see anybody, but that's fine. So with search, with the escrow account, is that based on a date, or what is the?
It's based on, and I'm not going to use the exact terminology, but we're waiting. I believe it's Medicare or Medicaid. There's an additional liability related to the first, much more significant liability. We don't expect it to be much at all. It should be pretty minor, but in the asset purchase agreement, that was part of the terms there. And so every bit of payment that they make to the city, which I think there's about 2 million in escrow right now, that's has to stay in escrow until that's resolved. Which it probably won't be an issue, but it really does impact our unassigned fund balance. And in a year where we're looking at, we usually, if we dip into our unassigned, which if we run a deficit budget, that's what we do. It's usually pretty minor. And, this year there is the potential that it would be greater. I don't think it would, eat that away, but it could certainly make it much smaller.
Thank you.
Melissa?
Yep.
So we go back a slide. So this here in red, you can't see me moving my mouse up and down, sorry. The 9.49 million.
Yep.
Talk about that a little bit. That is that
Sure.
a sign?
The vast majority of that, about 6.7 million, is our liquidity reserves, which is outlined in our code. And so that's really to make sure, our cash flow ebbs and flows throughout the year. It's to make sure we have enough cash to be able to enough in our reserves that we don't get into a bind in terms of cash flow. Or if we do have an emergency, we haven't spent down the general fund to a point where we couldn't cover an emergency. And then we appropriated $500,000 from our emergency fund. So we have another 1.5 million in that red area. That is our emergency reserve. So that's there, it's available if we need it. But the intention is that it's there to help support us in the event of an emergency.
Okay, that doesn't equal 9.49.
No, we also have there's a smaller amount of escrow in there. Actually, you know what? I've got it right in front of me. We have some Title III funding from Secure Rural Schools, which is about $500,000. And then the escrow piece, which is the piece that the general fund put into escrow. So this is not the payments. The payments that Search made are in escrow in the hospital fund, but we have about $375,000 for escrow that is held by the general fund. And so that gets us to 9.49.
And is there something out there that defines emergency?
Well, there is definitely a process, and it's one that we went through earlier this year. So the administrator has to put forth, I believe it's John, is it an ordinance or a resolution?
Are we talking about the emergency spending or the emergency declaration?
Yeah, the emergency declaration.
The declaration we've done by resolution, but the spending portion of it is by ordinance.
Okay, so that's there has to be a declared emergency, and then the assembly passes an ordinance appropriating the funds from that very specific source.
Thank you.
So I think, one of our biggest challenges as we go into FY22 is what does the rest of FY21 have in store for us? So, we have things, we don't know what the economic impact beyond of the pandemic, beyond the impact to tourism. So how are our holiday sales looking? That could be positively impacted by where the Alaska Remote Sellers Commission is, and the work that they have been doing. There's a ton of retailers who are on board now, who have not previously been collecting and remitting sales tax. So that could be a positive impact, but we're still starting to see, what that impact is. We certainly haven't gone through a holiday season yet, being part of the Remote Sellers Commission. So, it's going to be, and we've had no way to capture the scale of online sales around the holidays in the past. So it's actually, I'm very excited to see the returns and see what the impact of that is. Again, we already spoke about the release of the hospital escrow. And then do we get cruise ships back in, at the beginning of next year? That's a hard one. If the vaccine rollouts go well and things kind of start getting back to normal, we might be looking pretty good by the end of 2021. But we can't count on that at this point. So that kind of brings us to the decisions that we need around the 22 budget for the general fund. So, the initial direction that John gave all staff is, throw away what you had last year and start fresh. And so that's what everyone's doing. They're really kind of starting with a zero-based budget and what do they need to do their jobs. But ultimately, we need to define and make sure we know what level of services we are budgeting for. So we have all of the core services that are mentioned in our charter and code: public safety, public works, which, we have streets, parks, recreation, buildings, education. And that's another thing to touch on, is we have no idea what's happening with the school bond debt service reimbursement. We'll be able to get through with what we have saved right now in the school bond debt service fund. We'll be able to get through 2022, but that's it, because there was no reimbursement this year. So, that's definitely a challenge, and that's going to be a significant expense to the general fund if that doesn't come back. Then we have all of the supporting services for the government functions. So we've got planning, assessing, legal, IT, admin, and clerks. And then I think another thing that we have, which is kind of core, which John might want to speak to more, is we have a number of kind of improvements and initiatives that are underway now, and where do we go with those?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I would like to jump in here real quick, and I apologize in advance if I step on some of your future bullet points here. But a couple things I want to point to when we say core services. We focused on Articles 9, 10, 11, and some of Article 12 in our charter to kind of define what our core services are and where we need to focus. And yes, I did ask staff to start with their budget development on a zero-based budget type approach. Basically, throw everything away you had in the past and find out what you really need. And this is kind of our guide. But we'll still need the assembly input to say, as they're building that, is the intent to maintain the same level of services. And first thing I want to hit on is the momentum and existing initiatives that we're doing right now, and kind of the effects that they're having. So the police department, we've got nearly a full staff, and at a short period of time we had a full staff, and that's the first time that's happened in about 14 years. And I think you'll see, and we have seen, overtime costs drastically reducing in that department. We've got almost all the department head positions full. So we're cutting down on some of the, in some areas, some of the contracted and purchases services. But one more thing I think we still need to focus on, if it's still workable in this budget, is centralized procurement and leasing. We've started some work on that. And that's also addressed in Article 11, I believe, of the charter. It talks about centralized purchasing, centralized procurement, and I think that's a system that we need to get better at. We're kind of a broken system right now. And you probably remember from a few months ago, that's also centralized leasing too, and we've started to make some efforts towards that in this whole lease compliance. And I think the number's about 87 leases that we have to go through, maybe a little more, but we're finding a lot of potential revenue that was left on the table just because of such a broken and disjointed system. So we'd like to put some efforts into moving that along for future revenues to make sure we're doing the purchasing and the leasing correctly. I also want to hit on where it says not specified but currently supported, where it says charitable donations, economic development, and social services. That's not in here to say we aren't going to do it. It's in here to say these are the choices that we make, and that's kind of what the assembly guidance is that we're looking for, is what level of those services do you want to maintain? So is it going to be a status quo, or are we going to start from scratch? I'll turn it back over to you, Melissa, if I answered your question.
All right. So, another piece is that, knowing, as I work on the general fund's revenue budget, I'm very likely going to be putting together a conservative budget. And so it's very likely that if we, keep things status quo, that our budget will be a deficit budget. It can be balanced, which by the charter, we are required to pass a balanced budget, but that means that we might dip into our reserves to some extent. We historically have been reluctant to present deficit budgets to the assembly. This is a year that if our guidance is that you don't want to see a deficit budget, that means that there is probably going to be pretty significant cuts to services.
Melissa,
And then- yeah,
I have a question for you.
yeah.
So since we already have an emergency resolution in place,
Mhm.
if we declare that this is an emergency year, which I think we can safely do, but that's another discussion, can we dip into the emergency, for lack of a better word, reserves, not the 3.8, I believe you said it was, it's just more conventional reserves, but into the, what is the process for saying we've been in an emergency now for what, 7 months, 8 months? And that as a definition of emergency, we can and should dip into that. What is that process?
I can jump on that, Melissa.
Sure.
My general opinion is our emergency declaration is very specified. It's COVID related, and it's tied to the governor's declaration, and ours would expire as soon as the state's expires. I think if to hit the intent you're driving at, I think it would, just general guess, I think it would require a modified type economic emergency declaration sort of approach. And also the ordinance that's tied to our existing declaration has a $500,000 spending limit on it. So I think that would need to be adjusted as well.
And I think just for the sake of simplicity, that unless we were faced with, a situation where our revenue was cut so drastically that it was looking like we were, going to go above and beyond that unassigned fund balance, that to me would be more the point where we would start looking into other options like the emergency reserve.
John, can I ask a question? So I know we're hitting this early on, which is a good thing. I'm just thinking out loud. It's hard to make a decision right now because we don't know what the cruise ship industry is going to be doing. Do you have any kind of hints, you or the mayor, have you received, I know you've emailed the assembly, a couple times on some things, but have you received any up-to-date information on their intentions, any plans, any kind of indicator of what it may be like next summer?
I have, and the discussions I've had with the cruise ship industry, and in fact, I had one yesterday. I believe cruising will be back next summer. It's going to be in a limited capacity, but a lot of that could change if the vaccine does what's hoped, and people are not afraid to travel. So I think you will see travel coming back, but not to the levels it was 2-3 years ago. If I can take a quick opportunity, there's another thing I want to throw in here because I think it's very important. It's not in our presentation, but as we talk about, the outlook that we have right now and the decisions we're looking for the assembly to make, I wanted to look at some historical numbers to kind of show that we in City Hall are doing everything we can to tighten the belt. I know that sometimes there's other opinions out there, but I pulled some graphs today over the past 10 years and adjusted our budget and our spending to current day dollars, just applied the standard inflationary rates to it. And over the past 10 years, the city's budget has been nearly flat. And I drew the trend line out for our expenses as well. And I'm going to put these graphs together because I'd like to share them. But I drew the trend line out for our expenses as well. And over the past 10 years, we've been spending less money as an aggregate. So there, I mean, we can dig into different funds and you may see different things, but overall, we're seeing a decrease in spending. Just over this past year, you probably remember in March, when the pandemic kicked off and I was brand new sitting here at my first meeting, we took the first draft budget and cut 10% off. We went back to the drawing board and cut 10% of it off and represented that to the assembly, and that's the one we passed. And again, this is very high level aggregate spending here, but our general fund expense budget, if we continue on the same path, the same spending straight line spending path we're on now, we could be under by another $1.16 million under the already cut budget. So I just want everybody to know we're doing our best to tighten the belt. So before it gets hard for everybody else, I want everybody to know that we're doing what we can to be as frugal as possible.
Mr. Mayor, could I add something to that or make a
Yeah, I
comment?
just had one part to further answer Kevin's question, and then the floor is yours. And Kevin, every indication that I've been getting from charter operators is that they are getting fully booked for next season as well. So at this point, I would expect charters to be running pretty full steam, you know, depending on king salmon limits and all that. But it does appear that those people know how to travel and are going to be able to travel within guidelines. And yeah, most operators are expecting a pretty full year from my understanding.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Rebecca?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm not even sure how to say this, but Administrator Leach, I just want to point out the belt tightening that you're talking about, for which I'm grateful, and I'm happy to have that brought to light or have folks, including me, made more aware of it. But I don't know of a positive way to say it. I kind of question the success of that, because look at the deferred maintenance getting done by the temporary employees that we have right now. I'm just thrilled with everything that's getting done in Sitka. With, I don't know if windfall is the right term, but we have this extra workforce right now because of COVID, thankfully. And a lot of great things are getting done with that. But I'm concerned about maintenance of city infrastructure in light of the belt tightening you're talking about. Like, yes, the belt tightening is happening. I appreciate it. Is it successful? And so I think that's a different discussion, but I appreciate the belt tightening as long as we're also aware of the cost of that. Thanks.
And yeah, thank you. Thank you for that point. And that actually gets into the next part of the presentation here. You know, Melissa's talking about the balanced budget, and her next issues are capital projects. So I think that's a good lead in if you want to start there, Melissa, or if we
Before we
skip over.
jump
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
sorry, I think on the same subject, you know, I read a lot of the travel news because it affects us so much. I think there's a huge pent up demand building. And Alaska and Sitka especially are incredibly well positioned to be the beneficiary of that, because while people want to go travel again, they don't necessarily want to go to Europe or other places right away, but we're close enough to home. And maybe I'm being a little bit optimistic, because I'm in the short term, we have some huge challenges, but as my sore arm is telling me, we really can see the light of the tunnel. And as we get, you know, we don't have to see 100% or full vaccination level, not 100%, before we start seeing some real number changes. And, you know, realistically, okay, May, but really June is when the tourist season starts. And I have a feeling that we're going to be pretty darn busy. And, you know, I appreciated the uh, presentation about our reserves. I have really very little hesitation to say this is an emergency. We need to commit the reserves and keep spending our city spending level relatively flat. Just because I really think that we're going to be, if anything, I think our projections in 22 are going to be under. We're going to be well under. So, I mean, in other words, we'll be making more money than we think we will. And that what Rebecca was saying, we can't, you know, we've got some things that are just in their early stages that we need to see the fruition on. And I'd hate to have us say, oh no, we've got to stay within our budget and not use our reserves and then get pushed back 10 years. So I'm sorry if that was rambling, but I think I made my point. Thank you.
And I think, you know, that the general conversation that brings us perfectly to the next comment. So one of the big cuts that we made going into FY21 was we did not appropriate any new funding for general fund infrastructure. So we ended up kind of money that we had already put to other projects. And, you know, some of these big street projects, we put a little aside each year until we have enough to get the project underway. And so, you know, those were reappropriated to address the critical issues. And, you know, there's still money there and there's certainly projects underway. But we also have a lot of things that need to happen. And, you know, the other piece is that the longer we wait to do them, the higher the cost. So these are really, these are areas for the general fund that we're looking for input on, you know, how much we do, how much we spend. And, you know, we can certainly, you know, take some time and have some assembly discussion here. We can go through the rest of the presentation, do it at the end, whatever works.
Melissa, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in again real quick, and I'll just very to the point, just say that the answers to the questions we're looking for right now, and they don't have to be made by motion or anything, is level of services, capital projects. Do you want us to continue with funding the capital projects and continue the existing initiatives, the momentum we have on staffing the current positions and the special projects? For me specifically, centralized leasing and procurement.
So used to saying, Mr. Mayor. So I guess I'll just throw my 2 cents in here. I appreciate what Tor and Rebecca have said, but I am a little leery about at this point just deciding to dip into or attempt to dip into our emergency fund. I just think it's a little premature to make that assumption. I don't know if it's possible, but it would be nice to wait just a little bit longer. I know this is a hard thing to ask, but feels like we're going to know a little bit more on how this season is going to be in the next couple months. I understand we have a lot of things that we need to pay for, and it does increase the costs by the longer we wait. However, you know, no one expected this pandemic to happen, right? It was totally unexpected, and it's great that we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think Tor's right. I mean, unless something major happens, we could have a huge demand for all we know. But my concern about dipping into emergency reserves is that is for an emergency, and I just feel like we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what the future holds. And what if we don't have a season next year? I don't want to dip into the emergency reserves until we absolutely fundamentally have to. And I'm not convinced we're there yet. But at the same time, I've heard about cutting services. What could we have a discussion about? I'm not saying I want to, I'm just wanting to know, you're saying, well, if we maintain our budget and don't dip into reserves, we have to cut some services. What would be those services? Because I haven't heard that yet, that we would be on the block or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's what we're looking for. That's the guidance we're looking for. And if it's easier, Melissa, jump in if I'm saying something incorrect here, but we could just come back with a maintaining the same level of services type budget. We could present that to you and look at what it does, see if it does dip into our reserves. The general impression is that it might, and we could present that if that's the desire. And then we could individually say, okay, we went a little further than we wanted to, so let's start picking away at some of the ones that we think are not.
I have a quick question. Maybe
My
from
hand
the-
is up too.
Yeah, sorry. Who was that? I just, what's that?
This is Valerie. My hand is up when
Oh,
you're
sorry.
done.
Go ahead, Valerie. I sorry, I couldn't tell who that was. Go ahead.
My comments would be, and I apologize if it's not good internet coverage, but my comments would be that I think that this is all a bit premature. We're coming up on the end of our second quarter of fiscal year 2021. And I think some of these decisions would be better decided after we know the picture of what the sales tax revenues are for this quarter. Is it as dismal as the first quarter? Who knows? I just am concerned that we might be rushing to judgment to dip into reserves. And you know me, I'm conservative. Thanks.
And or if I could jump in, I just want to clarify, I have not said that I think we should dip into reserves. I have not said anything like that yet. So I just want to be really clear where I stand, which is I have a lot to learn and I'm not ready to make big statements like that. Sorry, Tor, go ahead.
So my question, it kind of has to do more with the capital projects. And for the record, this has been if we need to dip into reserves, we need to, especially the 3 million plus, but because this is an emergency, but I'm thinking more in terms of the capital projects. Can we budget some items and stipulate in the budget that we're not going to start on them until next fall? So by then we would have a pretty darn good idea of how the summer went. And, say something to the effect of, okay, this doesn't happen unless we have another assembly vote on these items, so that it's a year-long deal, but not everything's, we can start the groundwork on some of these projects, but then say, okay, how was the summer? And so by August, September, we should have a pretty darn good idea. We may not have the actual numbers in, but we can all look out our windows and see how many cruise ships are at anchor, and make and kind of make some decisions. I don't want to say on the fly necessarily, but with a little more information at the end of the summer. Because I know that there's some capital projects that we'd really like to get going, but at the same time, if we put them in the budget with the clear understanding that these might get pulled, with that, it might allow us some flexibility to do some of these, put these things in the budget that need to happen, but realize that, okay, we may have to put it off for a year. I don't know if that's something that would drive you nuts down there, Melissa, or if that's a feasible idea.
I have to say that I would prefer that we do a supplemental appropriation if things look great. And capital is an area that we can do that. We're not necessarily, we're not, it's not like a position that's being filled or not. But that could certainly be an approach. I hesitate to appropriate the funding because, capital projects, they don't lapse, the appropriations don't lapse. And, once that appropriation is made, the administrator has that authority to spend. So it would just be cleaner to do a supplemental appropriation. But we could certainly go into what those priorities would be. Public Works has already put together a list of priorities. So we can come forward with that, and depending on how things start coming together, we can certainly be ready to do that.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Melissa. You've got the three phases of money of appropriated, committed, and obligated. And we appropriate the money and pretty much commit the money from the day the budget books are released and signed. And that's our marching orders as staff to spend it that way. It would be much easier and cleaner if we have a good half of a year and then come forward with a supplemental appropriation for additional funding if we have it available.
And that really falls along how I feel about this budget cycle right now is I've heard in this conversation we're going to start with a very conservative budget, which I do appreciate. I believe that that's the way that we need to be going. I also believe that if the year becomes fruitful in revenue, that we can then do a supplemental budget appropriation in order to potentially maintain or bring back some services that we might need. I realize that this year, some service areas are going to suffer. I believe that to be unfortunate, but I think, perhaps some lawns won't get mowed quite as regularly as they had before, or similar type items. I believe that also to be a short-term holdover situation. I don't believe that to be long-term. I do think that things are going to get better, but for this year, I really think we need to buckle down and potentially spend money later if money does come in. The two things that I'd like to give guidance on, at this point, I'm not convinced that we need to dip into our reserves. Further information could convince me, but at this point, I'm not ready to say that that's okay. I do want a balanced budget presented that does not have a deficit. So however we get there, I'll leave that to John and Melissa, but that would be my initial indications anyway.
Yeah, I'll just, I share that sentiment. Thank you.
Right. So just on that, I think it's a tough position for us to be putting staff in if we're looking for a no deficit balanced budget, and they're having to possibly, there are a ton of questions yet, that need to be answered, and none of us have that crystal ball to really know exactly how down we're going to be, but if we're asking them to, make the call on what kind of services would have to be cut, I'm not sure that. I think it would be a little more fair of us to, come forward with some of those suggestions, whether it's public services or capital or a little bit of a mix, or, certain sectors that we're willing to dial back right now until we've recovered or we have recovery funds. I think that's one of the other big questions that's looming right now with the funding that Congress is trying to put out. We know that there's not going to be support necessarily for local and state governments, but they have put something in there that's supposed to support schools. So if we're able to utilize, other funding to be, to provide our school services, maybe just for a short term, that frees us up a little bit to move some of those monies that we would have normally appropriated out of the general fund towards the school district to something else that might have a hole in it. So, but I think it would probably be a little more fair for us if we are asking them to bring forward a no deficit budget to provide some suggestions maybe. And if that can't happen tonight, yeah, maybe so be it. We need to come back at another point with our hard numbers or with our hard answers answered.
Guys, I hate to break in, but do you guys still have me? Am I back on?
You're here.
Yeah. Okay. I lost internet for a while, which shouldn't surprise anybody being on an island, but.
Well, how about this? Because I know it's going to be hard to get some very dialed in guidance here. And tell me if what I'm translating is accurate. What I think we should do is come forward with a budget at the same level of services, but with that, we offer up recommended cuts where necessary, using core services as the first thing, and then the non-core services, we'll put those forward as decision points of what do we do, what do we not do. As far as capital projects, we can bring you recommended capital projects, or we can bring you a prioritized list on which ones are most emergent, and we can hit those. And then as far as we talked about the momentum of existing initiatives and new projects, needs, I call it the wish list. We can bring those forward too as decision points, and the assembly can let me know if they want to continue funding those initiatives or pursue the new initiatives.
Yes, please.
Yeah, just in case I get knocked off again. Yeah, that sounds good. I think part of the problem is that we just don't know how much we're talking about going into reserves. Are we talking about a few hundred, couple 100,000, or are we talking about a couple million? And that's part of the problem.
Melissa, does that give you what you need?
Yeah, I think so. I think another thing that might be important to kind of factor in is the long-term impact of potential changes or potential cuts. Because I think we're all very much hoping that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that we are going to get back into a better spot. And I mean, I think another thing that, this is a particularly challenging year, but the past few years haven't been easy either, with good tourist seasons and, that kind of thing. So I think there's some core long-term challenges that we've been trying to work on, and we don't want to completely lose sight of those either.
And as you look at the long term for the capital questions that we have, I guess I would hope to see, and maybe this is just how it's done and I'm unaware, if there's any kind of projection of not just what it costs right now, but how much more will it cost? And I don't know if that takes a ton of time, or if there's just a basic factor of.
Yeah, we have a rough, it's not going to be exact, but we have a multiplier that we use.
Okay, so then whatever is brought forward as like priority list of capital projects will also have a sense of, if we don't do this right now, it's going to cost this much more in a year or two or whatever. Is that what we can expect?
We can do that.
Awesome. Thank you.
We have that now. And in my previous life, we used to call that the alligator chart, and I've started using that term at work now. So it'll have the line of where we're funded and the line of what we need, and you'll see year over year how the delta is increasing between those two lines, and we can make some decisions on that.
Okay.
All right, so I think you feel like we have what we need, John?
I do. I'm ready to go on to the next slide if you are.
And seeing how it is the top of the hour and we're at a good transition point here, we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll jump into the electric fund slide.
Okay. While we're doing that, I'm going to try and switch back to my computer, which is much better than the iPad. Can you guys hear me? Anybody?
Yeah, we have you at Centennial Hall.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I lost internet for a little while.
All right, so I have Tor back. Valerie, are you back on the line? Kevin Knox, are you back? Rebecca, are you back?
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. As soon as Kevin Knox and Valerie jump back on, we'll get this going. I guess I should ask Melissa Haley, are you back? It's kind of important as well.
I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back on, Stephen.
All right, thank you, Valerie. All right, we'll give it another minute here for Valerie to return. Valerie, are you back on the line? Okay, it doesn't appear that Valerie's back yet, but we do have a quorum. So I'm going to go ahead and go forward with the meeting tonight. Melissa?
All right. So for the electric fund, and what I'm going to do for the enterprise funds is just remind you where we are, beyond a general direction of where we want to go with the different rates. We're not looking to specify a specific rate right now. We're still, elaborating what the capital budgets and expense and revenue budgets are. So just general guidance here as we're working on the models to make sure that we're bringing forward kind of something that represents what you are looking for. So for the electric fund, we did not do a rate increase in FY20. And then also during FY20, we extended the winter rates because of the pandemic. So you can see the FY19 to FY20 revenue was, it was down. We were actually ahead of budget through January. Or February, but we had a cold winter. So that kind of offset it. We ended up meeting our budget, but revenue was definitely down. We did a 2% rate increase for FY21, and the models and what we came forward with the past couple of years have shown 2% rate increases going forward. This, we expect this to still be the case. We, again, haven't updated the models yet. But with the bond refunding we did at the beginning of this fiscal year, we should be able to maintain that kind of inflationary increase. With the goal, we really need to generate working capital in this fund to put toward the aging infrastructure. And the other really big challenge for the electric fund right now is recruitment. There's a lot of vacancies and no one is applying for these jobs. We're not offering enough money to attract people to them. And then I think the really only area of impact that we might start seeing from the pandemic is we're definitely seeing some balances on accounts growing. So that might be a challenge as we get later into the year. Fortunately, the subsidies have definitely helped, but I don't think that, I think there's going to be challenges as we go through the winter. So are there any questions on electric?
I guess Scott's obviously not there, but I really question whether or not we're going to be able to maintain a 2% increase, or purely on inflation roll rate and keep the lights on. I'm not going to suggest this year we talk about going any higher, but I think we need to keep it in the back of our minds that we really can't just stay at inflation and still keep, like I say, keep the lights on, and I'm not sure some of the big projects are necessary, but I think we need to be thinking in terms of something a little bit more than that as we go down the road.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And, part of, what drives the rate increases or lack thereof is consumption. And, projected future increases in consumption. And so it's something we have to always revisit. That's why we redo these models every year. And, I think, in the past couple of years that the electric fund went through, a couple years of more significant increases that were required to meet bond covenants and be generating any working capital at all for the fund. And so I think, the goal was to keep the rate increases fairly flat for a time. But certainly as we start looking out and getting a good capital plan in place, we're going to have to make sure we have the capital to fund it.
Melissa, I don't know. I see Michelle is on. When it comes to recruitment, has anyone considered, or is it even viable to do what the police department did, where we take people and have them do rotations of 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off? And that might be a little beyond the scope of the assembly to ask for that, but I'm concerned about overtime. Are we running into a ton of, is that part of the issue, is because we don't have enough staff, enough personnel, we end up paying out overtime?
That's certainly an issue. I think it's more, just making sure that we have kind of the positions filled that need to be filled. There's a cost to the city of overtime, but I think there's also an inherent cost when people are forced to work overtime. They burn out quicker, and then the whole cost of turnover is there. So
and then of course there's contractors like Chatham Electric, which do a great job, but they're very expensive.
yes. So, and, that's something that, we have a new director on board. It's his, first real budget process. So, I'm sure he's going to be coming forward, and it might be, he might have some new and exciting ideas. So.
And are the positions that are unfilled in the electric department, I'm assuming they're union positions, when is that contract up for negotiation?
I believe that, oops, sorry about that. I believe we just, I think they were on the cycle that we did, I think it was a year ago. So it's probably another 2 years. I might be wrong about that.
So there are certain things we can't change in budgeting based on that contract. Like when we negotiate that contract again, it might impact how we budget.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
And isn't it, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but from research and talking to people, a lot of the problem with the vacancies is we just have had a lot of longtime people who were working there forever, and they just kind of are all retiring or finishing up around the same time, and then it's harder to get new people in. And is that kind of accurate?
Yeah, that's a bit of it. I mean, it's kind of a perfect storm. You had a lot of people that were in the same positions for quite a while, and kind of retirements all stacked up on top of each other. But there's also we need to entice people to come work here as well. So it's a little bit of mix of everything. I wish I could point to one issue, but there's a few.
Okay, thank you.
My hand is up.
Yes,
Can I
Valerie.
speak?
Jump in when necessary. I can't see anybody on the screen, so.
I know, and I have like no video because I need to save like bandwidth or whatever, but my thoughts are in the challenges of filling these positions is that nobody wants to come to Sitka anymore. It's too expensive to live here. And when we talk about insignificant rate increases in the electric fund or the utility or whatever, you look at what our rates have been going exponentially up over the last 20 years because heaven forbid nobody said, yeah, we should keep raising them. But now all of a sudden it's like, no, we got to keep raising them. The more we raise rates, the more people are leaving town. And the more we raise rates, the less affordable it becomes. So you're walking like a tightrope trying to figure this stuff out. And it should come as no surprise. I'm still conservative and I probably will vote against any rate increases. Thanks.
So I'll just chime in here. I think we're all understanding and agreeing we're at that. We are trying to walk that line right now between making sure the rate increases are appropriate to cover our needs but not increase them so much that it decreases consumption or discourages people from even living here. This is a very early on budget meeting, but my personal preference at this point would be to maintain the status quo as far as a 2% rate increase to keep up with that cost. I understand that it was nice to have that 1 year break, and I believe that was important because we had many, many years of significant increases, and I think people were more just kind of shell-shocked about that. And if we can keep on keeping a cost of living kind of increase, I think that would be appropriate. We need to do that, but I don't want to raise it too much. So I think we're all in a way on the same page on that. We don't want to go too high, but we don't want it too low. So my opinion for the time being would be to maintain a 2% rate increase for fiscal year 2021.
Could I request, I need to understand more about how our rates are set. So do commercial users pay the same rate? These are kind of basic level questions that are probably too small a grain size for this conversation, but I need some education on how rates are set. And then I want to make sure that's as equitable as possible. We need desperately to be business friendly, but we also desperately need to keep Sitka affordable for the residents here. So how could I learn that, Melissa? Is there a guiding document?
They're all in the code. If you go under the public utilities section, and they're all spelled out. And what we do when there's a rate increase, the per kilowatt hour increase, if it's 2%, it'll go up 2% for everyone. If we were to change the fee, the monthly service fee, that would be changed separately. So that should give you what you need. It goes through, there's all of the different rate structures are all spelled out in there. I think it's Title 17.
And then I guess specifically I'm thinking about things like, do the processors use a lot more power in a certain season? Do they have demand charge, things like that? So I'll find it. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Hey guys, I have to step away for just a minute. I will be right back, but I've got to deal with something, so I'll be back in just a minute.
Thank you for the heads up, Tor. My thoughts on electric fund. I previously sat not in this seat, but at the assembly table and understood the need for inflationary adjustments of our enterprise funds, spoke in favor of maintaining inflationary adjustments because I understood the value of them. This year, I'm hard pressed to see the value in the inflationary rate increases. So my request to John and Melissa would be to sell me on this one. Sell me on all of the rate increases that you're going to put forward. Make a strong case for them so that not only I fully understand, but when I get questioned by members of the public asking me why the rates are going up, that I have something that I can tell them too that holds face. It's it's going to be very difficult for members of the public to accept rate increases this year. It's going to be difficult for me to accept rate increases. So I want as much homework, as much justification, as much selling of these increases as is possible within our budget timeframe.
And what we can do, Stephen, is I've done this in previous years. I don't think we really did it last year, but we can run models and we can say, if we do the 2% this year, that means, X, Y, and Z for the next few years. If we do 0% this year, and what we generally see is that if we forego a rate increase in 1 year, there tends to be a spiked increase in the future years. But we can absolutely spell that out so that you can, see the impact and make an informed decision.
And those may be helpful. I hope that that's not intensively time consuming, because that's not necessarily what I want. But I believe it's your next slide, it does say infrastructure, which is tied to the rates. So if you want a rate increase, convince me that the infrastructure that's going to pay for is absolutely necessary this year. I think that's going to be a very important one for not only myself, but the public when I have to justify this to them.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, and we'll give you as comprehensive model as we can. I know people have heard this before, but it is important to bring up because with some of these working capital funds, we really do need to know what happened in the past going forward, and kind of learn the story of how we got here. And then what we need to do to dig out of it. I don't want to say we need to know what happened before to place blame somewhere. It's just how do we dig out of the hole slowly. And as you know, inflationary rate increases are common everywhere. I mean, every time a new year starts, a gallon of milk costs more at the grocery store. And we will do our best to keep rates as low as possible. But as long as everybody understands that our operating costs will still go up, despite the whether or not the rate increase happens, and labor costs will increase that are already factored in for annual cost of living adjustments. So our cost of doing business will go up, and we'll absorb as much of that as we can to be sensitive to the needs.
Yeah, the cost of labor definitely goes up. There are some who will receive some cost of living adjustments next year, but I would say a large segment of our population doesn't get annual cost of living increases. They don't get inflationary increases in their pay. And I believe that to be true this year as well. So balancing those two is going to be ultimately important.
All right, are we ready to move on? All right, so I think we've kind of talked through our decision areas. We'll certainly come forward with the infrastructure. Again, that's really what's driving our rates. And it's not only what we need to do in FY22, but it's what we know we need to do 5 years and 10 years down the road, because we need to make sure that we're ready for that. So the other enterprise funds, we have water, wastewater, solid waste, and harbor fund. You can kind of see the working capital for each fund. The blue is FY19, the red is FY20. We're mostly seeing good trends here. Both water and wastewater have significant capital projects that are underway, and that fund is boosting working capital in preparation to start paying that debt service. Solid waste fund, you can see, is well below the line with negative working capital. It's still negative, but it's much less negative at the end of FY20 than it was at the end of FY19. Harbors, the big discrepancy here is the bond proceeds that were used for Crescent Harbor. So those were largely still in the bank at the end of FY19 and spent in FY20. So for the water fund, rates were increased 2% last year. The model showed 5%. So, we'll be rerunning the model there, and we can do the same thing for all of these funds that we talked about with the electric fund. We can show kind of different rate scenarios and what the ultimate impact of different, rate or lack thereof increases. Wastewater, again, we had 2% for FY21. Our model had originally, with the FY20 increase, we were supposed to increase 5.5%. And so we went to another inflationary increase there. Solid waste, it's again one of our most complicated funds. It's a different fund. This fund is not driven by capital needs, but it's driven by the contracts that we have to do the pickup, the shipping, getting rid of it at a landfill down south. This is one that it's going to start going negative right away if we don't do the increases. I actually just got a note that I have the CPI increase that one of our big contractors implements every December in my email. So I'll be reading that and see what that says. And then, I think John has mentioned to you that there's, there might be some changes with shipping and there might need to be, significant investment here. At this point, we just don't know. But most likely, a rate increase along the lines of what we thought was needed last year will be needed for FY22.
Can I jump in
Yeah.
quickly, Melissa? Since we're talking solid waste fund, I think most of you know the issue that Melissa's talking about with the requirement to possibly bale or compact the municipal solid waste and put it in a closed top container, which would require significant infrastructure improvements and a new baler or compactor and some training. I had informed our contractor that this budget meeting was coming up, and maybe they are watching, but I asked weeks ago for that contractor to provide to me in writing the hard date that things will stop if we don't provide certain requirements that they would place on us. In fact, we've asked for that multiple times and I still have not received that in writing. I've received notes from their subcontractor, but I have not received notice from the contractor. And at this point, it depends on how much risk we want to take, but I almost consider we stay status quo until I get that hard notice that it's going to happen. Thanks.
All right. So for the Harbor Fund, I know there's a Harbor Commission meeting coming up in January, so we'll certainly be talking about this then. Last year, the Harbor Commission approved 5% for starting FY21, so that'd go FY21 through FY23. And I think some of the challenges we're facing with the Harbor Fund is that we're seeing some of these big projects when we actually get to them, they're costing more than we anticipated in the master plan. So that's, definitely concerning. And then in order to maintain all of this infrastructure, and this is, most of you have heard this many times, but, can the ratepayers sustain these continued increases? And, if no, then what are the alternatives? So that's where we are for the rest of our enterprise funds. I don't know if there's any questions or additional comments.
Melissa, is it possible when you're running the models to look at some of the capital infrastructure costs that that any one of the funds has in it, and to say, if there's anything in there, like in particular, I'm thinking the harbor fund. The discussion always comes around to, if at some point we decide that we can no longer sustain the rate increases, so then the model doesn't work. So then within the model, you have to make some sort of adjustment of taking a piece of infrastructure out, using it till its useful life is over, and then that infrastructure is gone, which with the harbor fund, that impacts revenue, obviously, because then you don't have places to tie up boats. But I think we need to have that very real conversation, and I've been saying this for years. Like, if we cannot afford the rate increases, and we don't have other alternatives for funding, we need to decide, which system do we decide comes offline when its useful life is over? Is that Ceiling Cove? What happens if Ceiling Cove, that's, in its useful life, is peeled out? Is it Eliason? Is it, which one is it? And if it is any one of those, does that really even do us any good?
Yeah, and I can certainly work with harbors and try to see if they have a good way to kind of break down. I don't have available to me kind of revenue by harbor, but that would be really valuable information. So, even if we just get a generality, because we might see that, oh, well, if we take, Ceiling out, and take the revenue that's there, maybe it's a savings, but maybe it's a net loss. And, we'd have to have higher rate increases to sustain the other infrastructure. So that's something I can definitely work on and get in touch with harbors on.
And I think the other part of that too is, like, we definitely need to address the fact that apparently the master plan needs some adjustments. If marine construction costs have gone up, the inflationary rate has gone up faster than master plan was planning for, we should probably dial those numbers up then.
Yeah, no, I would feel much better doing that. So that's something I can also discuss with harbors about maybe looking at that.
So if I may, this is awkward, obviously, but I guess I have one comment on harbors specifically. I think it would be interesting to see, and as Kevin Mosier said a few times, if we decide that, okay, we're going to have to replace this much of a harbor or a harbor, basically, if we push that out and run it until it sinks, how much we can save in our increases. But then more in general, I think it would be useful if, while you are getting this information, while you're figuring this stuff out, if we would get emails kind of saying, okay, here's something about harbors, here's something about wastewater, so that when we get to this point, we're all a little better informed. And while I'm not necessarily happy about getting even more emails, I think it would be nice to have some of this information as it's coming out, so that by the time we get to this point, we're a little better informed. So thank you.
I mean, one thing that I could certainly, do as we're, refining our models, I can, potentially kind of put together summaries of, of what's going on with them, and get those out ahead of time.
Yeah, I don't want to add to your load, but it's more like kind of So we're not just talking about this once a year, so we're all kind of on the same page by the time we get now.
And so on the last slide, I advocated for as much information as possible for the rate increases. I'm going to say the same about these, with the exception of the solid waste fund. At this point, I very much understand the contractual increases. I also understand that AML has increased their rates pretty substantially. Unfortunately, I think that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the community, from whether that's shipping out your garbage or shipping in your milk. We're definitely going to see that next year throughout the community. So unfortunately, that is happening. And so I understand where solid waste is. But again, as much justification of rate increases in these funds as you guys come up with, I would much appreciate seeing.
All right. So I think that brings us, and we've kind of been discussing as we've gone, but I don't think anyone is arguing that that the rate increases are not needed, but we have to balance that. We have to balance it. We have to know that delaying increases might mean that you have bigger increases in the future. We also have to weigh in the burden on the community, particularly this year. I think to kind of offset that, we did have a number of subsidies that hopefully helped people who really needed it. That I think some funds can withstand a year or two of lower than recommended increases easier than others can. Particularly, Stephen was right on when he said solid waste. That one, is at the very top of my list, and probably followed by the electric fund. Just given the sheer amount of infrastructure that fund holds, and the fact that some of it is really old. And again, the rates are driven by the infrastructure that we need to maintain. And so looking at that, and I think especially with harbors, what infrastructure do we maintain? So I think that's it for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. If I can take 1 minute, there's one more thing I want to talk about as a consideration to bring into this year's budget. And this is fresh in my mind because I've had so many debriefs with DOT and MARAD, the organizations that offer the build grants and PIDP grants over the past few weeks. I think we need to set aside some money for some planning. I think we're seeing now that we have these discussions over rate increases every year, when there's a possibility that we could plan these things in. We could do some better planning on our infrastructure. We could update our master plan. Some funds don't have master plans. We have a comp plan, but we don't have any strategic plan. And in these debriefs that I've had, one of the questions I got from DOT just a few weeks ago was, could I get a copy of your strategic plan? And I kind of chuckled and said, we don't have one. And they said to me, well, where are you guys going? Like, how can I point you in the right direction? I need to know where you're going. And I think there's a lot of value in having a document to point back to and a goal in sight. So if there's room and we can build in some planning, I think that would help us dial in our expenses down the road and prepare a little more for upcoming needs. Thanks.
I definitely support your looking at the long-range infrastructure plans, revisiting those, and making sure that the plans that we have right now coincide with the needs of the community. Also, getting a strategic plan in place is going to alleviate a lot of these heartburn and concerns and discussions in the future. So planning is important. Planning takes time. I, for one, am willing to help in that process, but I do understand there are a lot of priorities at the municipality right now.
Well, are there any other questions from the assembly before I thank Melissa for her presentation and close up?
I just was curious where I could find a history of rates for each of the funds. It must exist somewhere. I did a quick look on the electric department website, utility website, and didn't see it there immediately.
Have some documents. Unfortunately, there is not, there's no place public that I know of that has a clear history of the rates.
Is that context that you were talking about, Mr. Leach, I think really helps people understand when increases do happen. Some of the increases we're talking about aren't coming out of the blue. Like we had some fairly flat or no increase years for quite a while. But the illustration of that is really important. So I would like to see it, and maybe we could make it publicly available too.
This is Valerie. I have a spreadsheet where I was tracking rate increases of garbage, water, sewer, and electric from, I want to say 1998. I don't have my hands on it right now, but when I get back, I will share it with the administrator, and if he cares to share it, he can send it on to you people.
And I also just forwarded a spreadsheet that former Assembly member Tristan Gavon put together, indicating rate increases from 1980 to 2018. So that should be in the Assembly's inbox right now. And is there anything else from the Assembly for either Melissa Haley or John Leach, or any discussion amongst ourselves before we move on down the agenda this evening? Hearing none, seeing none, I'd like to thank John and Melissa for this presentation tonight. It definitely gets your head around the budget process so that we can all start thinking, so that we can all start putting in some input and then having some fruitful discussions. I know one of the big things I'm taking away from this, and what I'm going to come forward with next time, is if I've asked for a no reserves, no deficit budget, where do we find that money? So I'm going to start digging into those services and line items, service areas that we may be able to spend a little less on this year, and run that past the administrator, see how he feels about it. So that's my big takeaway. I hope this meeting was fruitful and productive for everybody. But I do thank Melissa and John for their time tonight. Moving on to persons to be heard. This is public participation for any item on or off of tonight's agenda, not to exceed 3 minutes. Is there any public participation? Yes, please.
Good evening, Richard Ween. I only have 180 seconds, and so I will be bullet pointing it. As far as budget goes, especially this year, it needs to be a bird in the hand, and you can't plan something with two in the bush. Any additional funds that come in due to luck or good fortune can be supplemental appropriations. You need a realistic budget and move things along. As far as the strategic plan goes, you have to include in that strategic plan not the old fanciful thinking that has been going on within the city, but you need to include the demographics that there are changing. People appear to be leaving the city. There's a decline, et cetera, and therefore these need to be factored into what our future needs are, and they also need to be realistic. And I know that I've personally said it time and time again, we need to be independent as far as solid waste goes. We generate millions of user fees for solid waste, and we need to develop a comprehensive solid waste plan to channel those fees into something which we can then bring back to ourselves, as opposed to be totally captive to outside forces in these contracts. And I know there are ways, definitely there are ways to do that. Birds Coming Home to Roost, Secure Rural Schools. That was $256,000, which we could have done in exchange for with CARE funding. And therefore, that's money that would have gone to the general fund, which we could have used for roads and infrastructure. And we could have swapped it out with the schools. And we also continue to give away money in that we didn't have to during this time of COVID, which could have been in the general fund. Now you're going to have to look for cuts. So please use your imagination. The best part is that the state is going to be in a real pickle, and I can assure you that revenues are going to be difficult to come by. So the bond reimbursement may not be realistic. If it happens, it's wonderful. The cost of living continues to go up and up and up. But here's something that's interesting, and this is just a muse. If you multiply 5,000 by 8,800, what do you get? You get $44 million. Excuse me, 44 million. It's kind of interesting that Governor Dunleavy was suggesting a $5,000 permanent fund. Dividend. And so my notion is that that permanent fund will give $44 million infusion into the city. And my notion is that we keep talking about, and this is just another sentence, that we keep talking about what to do with this. I think that people who have not, what can
Point
I
of
say?
order, Your Honor, Mr. Mayor, I mean, 3 minutes is how much has been allocated for this.
Thank you, Tor. I appreciate
And thank you for
the
your
point
comments
of
this
order.
evening.
Okay, thank you. But you get the point.
Is there anyone else from the public who'd like to be heard on or off the agenda this evening? All right, seeing none, there is no executive session, so we'll move on to adjournment.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you to the assembly this evening.